At 63, Harold Whitman had given his whole life to his family. He built their house with his own hands, co-signed their future, and just before Christmas, they sent him a voicemail that changed everything. This is not just a story about betrayal. It's about what we do when love becomes a debt we never signed up for. They say the older you get, the more you see things clearly. But some truths don't show themselves until they break your heart. Harold Whitman was 63 when his daughter, Lacey, called him her safety net. She meant it as a compliment. He smiled on the outside. But inside, something shifted, because he realized she wasn't wrong, and that was the problem. 6 years earlier, Harold had co-signed a $390,000 mortgage for Lacey and her husband, Jason. They were denied the loan on their own. He didn't hesitate. "What's family for?" he said, handing over his signature like it was just another Christmas gift. At the time, Harold still lived in his modest ranch home in Cedar Falls, Iowa. A retired lineman, he had worked 3 decades climbing power poles in snow and summer sun. He wasn't rich, but he was dependable, reliable, the guy who never said no. He never asked to be repaid, never questioned the new cars they drove, the backyard pool they built, or the luxury vacations they posted on Facebook. Even when he had to patch his own roof himself because money was tight, Harold stayed quiet. Until the voicemail came. It was 2 days before Christmas. He was making cocoa when the message buzzed in. It was Lacey's voice, flat and rehearsed. "Hi, Dad. So, we've decided not to do Christmas this year. Things are complicated. You'll probably be hearing from our lawyer after the holidays about the mortgage stuff. Take care." Just like that. Christmas was off. Love turned into liability. Harold didn't reply. He didn't drive over. He didn't cry. He just sat by the window for hours, watching snow fall across the porch he built with her initials carved in the wood. What happens when the people you gave everything to decide you're no longer convenient? Is loyalty still loyalty when it's only expected one way? For anyone who's been the strong one too long, this story might feel uncomfortably close. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to ask, when do we stop sacrificing and start saving what's left of ourselves? Harold hadn't always been the kind of man who bit his tongue, but life teaches silence when your voice doesn't seem to matter. Back in the early 2000s, Harold and his late wife Marlene had been the heartbeat of their neighborhood. Sunday potlucks, 4th of July BBQs, the kind of couple whose porch light always stayed on a little longer for neighbors who needed it. When Marlene passed from cancer in 2011, something in Harold folded inward. His house grew quieter, but his sense of duty only grew louder. So, when Lacey called him in tears 6 years ago, saying the bank had denied their mortgage for the new home outside Des Moines, Harold didn't hesitate. She was his only child. "I'll co-sign," he said, like it was nothing. But it was everything. The house she wanted wasn't modest. It had crown molding, a 3-car garage, and a foyer bigger than Harold's living room. But he told himself, maybe this is how love looks now. Signatures instead of hugs, equity instead of presence. At first, things felt stable. Lacey and Jason made their payments, and Harold stayed in the background. He kept mowing his lawn with the old rusting John Deere, kept fixing that same screen door that never quite shut right. The days rolled by, like coins dropped into a jar you never planned to spend. But little things began to change. When Harold couldn't make it to Lacey's birthday dinner because of a doctor's appointment, she said, "You've always got some excuse." When he mailed her a handwritten Christmas card instead of a Venmo transfer, she didn't respond at all. And when her husband, Jason, casually mentioned during a backyard BBQ that, "We basically wouldn't have this house if it weren't for us pulling the right strings," Harold felt a strange heat rise in his chest. Us? The only string they'd pulled was his name. But still, he said nothing. Then came the gradual distancing, fewer calls, shorter visits. His role in their lives shrank from father to co-signer, from grandfather to emergency contact. He learned about Lacey's second pregnancy from Facebook, saw his grandkids' Halloween costumes online before he saw them in person. And yet, he still brought over a turkey every Thanksgiving, still showed up with a toolbox when their garage door jammed, still answered every call, especially the ones that began with, "Hey Dad, I hate to ask, but..." So when the voicemail came that winter, canceling Christmas and hinting at lawyers, Harold wasn't just heartbroken, he was disoriented. Had he imagined the relationship? Was he just a line on a document all along? He thought of Marlene then, and how she used to say, "Love isn't a ledger, but people will treat it like one if you let them." She was right. For years, he'd let guilt and duty drive him. For years, he'd believed that being needed was the same as being loved. But as he sat in that empty house, cocoa going cold on the counter, Harold finally faced the truth. He had trained them, by example, to expect without reciprocating, to take without thanking. He stood up, walked to the mantel, and looked at the last family photo they'd taken together. Everyone had been smiling, but now all he saw were teeth, not connection. That night, he made a decision. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be vengeful, but it would be final. He opened his filing cabinet, pulled out the original mortgage documents, and began reading. Carefully, quietly, deliberately, because sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is to stop being the one who always says yes. The next morning, Harold woke up with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The hurt hadn't disappeared, but it had settled, like a storm that had passed, leaving wreckage in its wake, but also fresh air. He brewed his coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the yellow legal pad he used for everything from grocery lists to handwritten prayers. On the top line, he wrote, "What I've given." He began listing it all. The $390,000 mortgage he co-signed, the $1,500 loan to replace their water heater, the $4,000 he'd wired when their second car broke down, a dozen smaller gifts. Just for the grandkids, just this once, we'll pay you back. It added up to more than $72,000 over 6 years, and none of it was ever returned. He wasn't keeping score out of bitterness. This was clarity, not revenge. Harold had spent a lifetime working with numbers, on utility poles, cable lines, and retirement calculators. Numbers didn't lie. And what they told him now was this: his silence had been costly. That afternoon, he drove to the local bank, the same one where he'd signed the co-signer paperwork. The branch manager, Susan, remembered him. "Still driving that old Dodge, Harold?" She smiled. He returned a small grin. "Runs better than my credit rating at this point." She laughed until she looked at the documents he placed on the desk. "I need to find out how to remove myself from this mortgage," he said calmly. Susan's face softened. "That's not easy, Harold, but it's not impossible, especially if you're not living in the home and can prove undue financial burden." They spent an hour going through paperwork, timelines, and options. Susan connected him with a real estate attorney in town, Eleanor Rowe, who'd helped in similar family disputes before. Later that week, Harold sat across from Eleanor in a quiet office that smelled of leather-bound books and freshly brewed tea. After reading through his documents and notes, she looked up and said, "Mr. Whitman, what you've described isn't just a financial issue. It's a pattern of dependence, emotional, legal, and economic." He nodded slowly. "I let it happen." "You did," she agreed gently. "But you're doing something now. That matters." She laid out a plan: petition for legal release, notify the borrowers formally, begin proceedings through the lender. It would take time, but Harold had no illusions. He wasn't trying to fix Christmas. He was trying to fix the rest of his life. Before leaving, she asked, "Are you prepared for how they'll react?" He hesitated. "They'll be angry, hurt, maybe embarrassed." Eleanor folded her hands. "You need to remember something, Harold. The people who benefit from your silence will always call your boundaries selfish." That night, he sat on his porch, a wool blanket across his knees. Snowflakes drifted down like they had every year since Marlene passed. But this time, he wasn't waiting for a call or a knock on the door. For the first time in years, Harold Whitman wasn't bracing himself to be needed. He was preparing to be free. And freedom, he realized, doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it comes with a signature, a sunrise, and the quiet decision to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. 3 days after Harold filed the petition to remove himself from the mortgage, the silence cracked. It started with a text from Lacey. "Dad, we need to talk. The bank called. What's going on?" He stared at the message for a long while. She didn't ask how he was. She didn't say she missed him. No acknowledgement of the voicemail that had severed Christmas. Just alarm about the mortgage. He set the phone down and went back to sanding the edge of a cedar bench he'd been working on. An hour later, a call from Jason. Then another. Then another. No voicemail. Just that same name flashing on his old flip phone, like a siren he no longer responded to. By evening, the tone shifted. "Why would you do this to us? Don't you realize what this means for the house? After everything we've done together as a family?" Harold turned the phone off. The next morning, it was a voicemail from Lacey, her voice brittle with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "You didn't even warn us. You just acted. This is going to mess up everything. The bank says we may have to refinance, Dad. We're not sure we'll qualify." There it was. The word. Qualify. The same word they'd used to convince him to co-sign 6 years ago. The same word that had been repeated with tight smiles and reassurances that it's just paperwork. Now it was a threat, not a promise. Later that week, Harold received a certified letter from a law office in Des Moines, Jason's cousin apparently, seeking clarification on Mr. Whitman's legal intent. He scanned it, handed it to Eleanor Rowe at their next meeting, and watched her chuckle. "They're bluffing," she said, setting the letter aside. "You're well within your rights, but don't expect them to back down quietly. People rarely do when you disrupt the system that benefits them." He nodded. It wasn't about the letter, or the calls, or even the possibility that Lacey and Jason might lose the house. It was about how quickly love had been repackaged into leverage. Still, he wasn't made of stone. There were moments, quiet ones, where doubt crept in. Sitting at the kitchen table at dawn, looking at Marlene's photo, watching neighbors carry gifts to their kids' homes, reading old cards from Lacey back when Dad had hearts around it. Had he gone too far? Was this what setting boundaries looked like? Empty holidays and legal papers? Then, one night, he received a different kind of message. Not from Lacey, not from Jason, but from a young woman named Sarah, his oldest granddaughter. She was just 13, but her message hit him like a bell ringing clean in cold air. "Hi, Grandpa. Mom and Dad are super mad, so I probably shouldn't text. But I just want to say, I love you. I miss your stories and the way you whistle when you drive. Hope I can see you soon." He read it twice, then again, and something inside him softened, but didn't collapse. He replied simply, "I love you too, sweetheart. Always. And we'll see each other soon. That's a promise." It reminded him that doing the right thing didn't mean doing the easy thing, and it didn't have to mean cutting love off at the root. It meant trimming it back so it could grow again, without choking everything around it. By week 2, the financial review from the bank had begun in earnest. Lacey and Jason were asked to submit tax documents, income statements, and a formal refinancing application. Jason's job had changed. Lacey hadn't been working steadily. Their approval wasn't guaranteed. Harold braced himself for the storm, and it came, just not from where he expected. That Sunday, there was a knock on the door. Not frantic, not aggressive, measured. When he opened it, there stood Lacey. No coat, just a sweater clinging to her frame. Her eyes were red, and her hands shook slightly as she held a crumpled envelope. "Can we talk?" she asked. He stepped aside without a word. They sat at the kitchen table, where every big moment of her life had unfolded. Report cards, prom night photos, wedding invitations. She looked older than he remembered, tired in a way that went beyond sleep. "I was angry," she said finally. "Still am, a little. But I've been thinking about how we got here. She opened the envelope and pulled out a printed list. I went through all the help you gave us, the money, the house, the babysitting, the holidays. I didn't realize how much you'd carried. Harold said nothing. I guess, she continued, I started seeing your support as something permanent, like the plumbing or the roof, always just there. She took a shaky breath. I don't know what happens next. I'm not asking for you to take it back. But I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. Harold reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. I'm not angry, Lacey, he said quietly, but I had to stop the bleeding, not because I stopped loving you, but because I started remembering how to love myself too. The days after that quiet conversation at the kitchen table didn't bring any fireworks. There were no grand reconciliations, no teary family dinners, just a slow, uncertain thaw. Lacey didn't come by again that week, but she sent a few short texts, updates about the kids, a photo of Harold's youngest grandson, Mason, dressed as a robot for School Spirit Week. No emojis, no apologies, just presence. That was enough. Jason, however, remained silent. Harold expected that. Pride was a heavy shield for some men, and Jason had welded his from years of playing provider without ever really providing. Now that Harold had stepped out of the picture, Jason was facing something he wasn't prepared for. Consequence. The bank's decision came sooner than expected. Harold received a letter confirming he had been officially removed from the mortgage. The language was clinical, but the feeling it gave him was anything but. For the first time in 6 years, he wasn't legally tethered to another household's spending habits. The paper represented something simple, yet profound. Freedom. He folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box labeled, Things I Kept for Me. Inside were Marlene's old recipes, a baseball card from 1968, and the hospital bracelet from the day Lacey was born. That weekend, Lacey called. The refinancing went through, she said. Her voice sounded steadier, but not cheerful. We're locked into a higher interest rate. Payments are tight. I figured as much, Harold said, sipping coffee on his porch. A long pause. Still, it's ours now, fully ours. He could hear something behind her words. Maybe ownership, maybe fear, maybe both. That matters, he said gently. Another pause. Then, we're trying to budget better. Jason's adjusting. I'm looking for part-time work again. I'm glad to hear it, Lace. I didn't call for help, she added quickly, as if afraid he'd misread the call. I know. That moment, the space where she could speak without expectation and he could listen without obligation, was something new for both of them. It felt like a tentative step into real adulthood. Not just hers. His too. Because boundaries weren't walls. They were doors you closed gently and reopened on your terms. That fall, Harold was invited to Mason's school play. No big gestures. Just a handwritten invitation from his granddaughter, tucked inside a drawing of a tree with Papa Harold at the roots. He went, sat in the second row, brought flowers. And afterward, when Mason hugged him and whispered, "Did I do good?" Harold's throat tightened. "You did great," he said, brushing a tear with the back of his hand. Later, while waiting in the hallway, Lacey approached him, holding 2 paper cups of lukewarm cocoa. "Thanks for coming," she said. "I wouldn't have missed it." She hesitated before sitting beside him on the bench. "You know," she began, looking down at her cup, "we used to think of you as unshakable, like you'd always be there, no matter what." "I know," Harold replied. "I made that pretty easy to believe." She nodded. "It's strange now, taking care of things ourselves, but it's also good. I feel stronger, in a way I didn't before." Harold looked at her, really looked. Not the little girl in braces, not the stressed young mother, but a woman learning her shape without leaning too heavily on anyone else. "That's how it's supposed to be," he said. They sat in silence, listening to the buzz of children's voices behind the auditorium doors. And for the first time in a long while, Harold didn't feel like a lifeline. He felt like a grandfather, a father, a man who had done what needed doing, not to rescue, but to restore balance. That night, back home, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to Marlene. Not to send, not to share, just to write. You'd be proud, hun. Not because I held the line, but because I finally saw what had to change. Lacey's finding her own footing. The kids are growing. I miss you every day, but I think I'm finally learning how to stand still again. Not just wait to be needed. Not just fix things. Just be. He folded the letter and placed it in the box. In the months that followed, Harold and Lacey began to rebuild. Not back to how things were, but toward something better. The calls became more regular. The visits more genuine. She even came by one afternoon with muffins she'd baked herself. From Mom's old recipe, she said with a sheepish smile. Too much nutmeg, Harold teased. I was hoping you'd say that, she laughed. There was no finish line, no final scene, but there was space, respect, and maybe, for the first time, a real chance to be a family again, not bound by obligation, but by choice. December crept in quietly, like an old friend, unsure if it was still welcome. Harold hadn't planned on doing much that year. After everything that had happened the Christmas before, the voicemail, the cold silence, the legal papers, it was easier to imagine the holidays as just another set of days on the calendar. No tree, no lights, no expectations. But grief has a way of turning into grace when you give it space to breathe. One afternoon, 2 weeks before Christmas, a knock came at the door. Harold opened it to find Sarah, his teenage granddaughter, standing with a small box wrapped in newspaper and twine. I made this in shop class, she said, cheeks pink from the cold. Mom doesn't know I came. Inside the box was a hand-carved ornament, a wooden heart, rough-edged but solid. Burned into it were the words, "For the roots that held, even when the branches bent." Harold didn't say anything for a long time. His eyes welled up, and Sarah reached out, awkwardly at first, then pulled him into a hug. I want us to do Christmas, she whispered. Maybe not like before, but still. The next day, Lacey called. Sarah told me she came by, she said softly. I didn't stop her. I guess I hoped she would. There was no tension in her voice, just acknowledgement, and maybe hope. I was thinking, she continued, we could come over on Christmas Eve. Nothing big, just us, just real. Harold paused, looked at the bare mantel, then at the small wooden box on the counter where he'd kept the mortgage letter and Marlene's recipes. All right, he said, let's keep it simple. And they did. On December 24th, Harold dusted off the old ceramic nativity set Marlene had collected over the years. He found the string lights in the basement, most of them still working, and hung them around the porch railing. No big tree, just a small spruce in a pot, which Sarah decorated with paper snowflakes and Harold's childhood train whistle. That evening, Lacey arrived with the kids and a covered dish that smelled like her mother's sweet potato casserole. Jason came too, quiet but present. He offered to fix the loose screen door before dinner. They ate on mismatched plates. No one said grace out loud, but the silence between bites felt full, not hollow. After dinner, Sarah handed out small gifts, none of them expensive, but each thoughtful. A knit scarf, a bookmark etched with the initials H.W., a photo of Mason at his play, framed with "Best Grandpa Ever" in glitter pen. Before they left, Lacey lingered at the door. Thank you, she said. For what? Harold asked. For not giving up on us, she replied, even when you stepped away. He nodded, not trusting his voice, just squeezed her hand gently. When the house was quiet again, Harold sat by the window with a cup of cocoa. Outside, the porch glowed with soft light, and the little spruce stood sturdy in the snow. It wasn't the Christmas he used to know, but maybe it was the one he needed, a quieter celebration, a reclaimed peace, and the beginning of a new kind of family, one shaped not by expectation or debt, but by honesty, boundaries, and slow-earned trust. Winter lingered longer than usual that year. The days were short, but something in Harold's heart had stretched wider than it had in years. He no longer measured time by silence or sacrifice. Now it was the sound of Sarah's laughter on the phone, the occasional Saturday visit from Lacey, and even a rare text from Jason with a photo of the kids raking leaves. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had softened into something wiser, something he could hold without bleeding. One afternoon, in early January, Harold stood in his backyard beside the little potted spruce from Christmas Eve. He knelt down, dug a small patch of earth near the porch, and planted it. It was a quiet gesture. No one saw it, but it meant something. The tree hadn't been perfect, short, slightly lopsided, but it had survived the season. And now, like him, it had a chance to take root in better soil. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, flipping through old letters and recipes. He paused on one, Marlene's handwriting, soft and looping. Strong love isn't loud. It listens, it stays, and sometimes it steps away until it's safe to return. Harold closed his eyes and let the words settle. That's what he had done, not out of resentment, but out of necessity, out of love, for them, and finally, for himself. He hadn't burned bridges. He'd rebuilt boundaries. He hadn't won by proving anyone wrong. He'd won by remembering who he was, outside of being needed. There would be other hard days, but they wouldn't find him unprepared anymore. Because now, Harold Whitman knew the difference between being generous and being used, between showing up for others and disappearing in the process, between love that gives freely and love that quietly demands too much. And for the first time in a long, long while, he felt something he hadn't felt since Marlene passed. Not peace, not joy, dignity, the kind that comes from knowing you still have love to give, just not at the expense of yourself. We don't talk enough about the quiet people, the ones who show up, give without asking, and carry burdens they never speak of. People like Harold. For much of his life, Harold believed love meant saying yes, that being dependable was the same as being loved. But life has a way of revealing the truth, even if it comes through heartbreak. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's how we teach others to treat us with respect. And sometimes, the most courageous thing we can do isn't to give more, but to step back, hold steady, and let others learn to stand on their own. If you've ever found yourself carrying too much for too long, this story is for you. You are not just a helper or a cosigner or a fixer. You are a whole person, deserving of rest, of dignity, and of relationships that give as much as they take. And if you're wondering whether it's too late to reclaim that, it's not. Because the best parts of life often begin at the moment we decide, I matter too.